IVT's Validation Week returns in person this October, and it'll also be held virtually. This is the gold standard event for quality and validation professionals. Prepare to zero in on proven strategies for achieving regulatory compliance and educational training with top industry experts to ensure quality across the life sciences. Taking place in a hybrid format, in person October 19th to 21st in Philadelphia, and virtually October 26th to 28th. You'll have your top concerns addressed by key opinion leaders and benefit from benchmarking and knowledge sharing on the most critical topics in process validation, computer system validation, cleaning validation, equipment qualification, data integrity, and much more. This uniquely formatted event provides opportunity for all to gain the necessary training and discuss the most crucial topics in validation today. Plus, you can earn GMP training hours while attending. Validation Week 2021 is an event you cannot afford to miss. Visit informaconnect.com/valweek for full details on the agenda, registration, and team rates.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. We have a special episode for our listeners today featuring clips from a recent panel discussion during the Computer Systems Validation Week conference, with some thought-provoking questions and reactive commentary from a longtime industry consultant, David Nettleton. David, it's great to have you with us today.
Hey, it's great to be with you again. Thank you for having me.
Of course, our pleasure, as always. So the session CSA Revolution was intended to provide a better understanding of the intent and scope of the FDA's computer software assurance guidance, while highlighting CSA's relationship to other existing regulations. Key concepts of CSA include the push for critical thinking and risk-based principles as part of the lifecycle strategy in support of data integrity, and how CSA promotes better use of data for the benefit of the patient safety and product quality. And that, of course, was, featured, one of the panel discussions featured at our spring event. So let's review the first clip.
This is something that has actually been in scope of what we've issued before in guidance, our interpretations. There is value, there's opportunity, and the end of the, end of the day of what we're trying to really get out of this is to reset thinking around the industry in order to accelerate and really bring in the adoption of these technologies, of the capability to get information, to get data, to really drive more insights into your organization that in the end really impact patient safety, patient quality, but have in some way, shape, or form really not been focused on, invested in due to maybe just our lack of clarity. And you'll hear more of it throughout the course of the discussion, impact it's had, how to get things really started and engaged. And we'll reaffirm that, again, a lot of these principles we've already said they're acceptable. In order to drive that clarity home, we've been really working on drafting a guidance that clarifies all these ideas, and we'll be moving that through our system. And that's in the process right now of its clearance and the several levels of review that it needs to go through. But hopefully, as you'll see, there's nothing that should stop you or does stop you from being able to take advantage of this and really driving some of the improvements and changes that this can deliver now.
David, in this clip that we just heard, we hear the FDA describe the guidance as being in scope of previously issued guidance, and that the intention is to reset industry thinking. Lack of clarity from FDA will be clearly defined in this newer guidance. So to kick us off, I want to first get your thoughts on previously issued guidance in CSV.
The law itself and the guidance documents provide ideas about what computer system validation is and some of the elements of the process, but they don't provide a recipe for how to go about it. I think of this analogy. A doctor says you need to eat better and get more exercise, but that isn't very helpful unless you know how to make those changes. In short, I find that the guidances on CSV are only slightly helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, great point. Great point. It's not necessarily the hows and whats, but just the do's, do's and do nots, right? Not as helpful as we might hope. So do the clarity issues then described, in this clip on the FDA and previously issued guidances or on the manufacturer? Yeah, see. Do the clarity issues described here fall on the FDA and previously issued guidances or on the manufacturer's interpretation of those guidances? Like, it's hard to know who really is the one needing to make the changes here.
Hey, I totally understand the confusion here. And for many years, I was confused myself. But when I worked on the basis of Part 11 in the mid-1990s, before the law came about in 1997, I wanted a recipe for the CSV process. I worked with representatives from many of the FDA-regulated areas. I think there was about 400 of them, actually, to create an outline of the process. We were expecting both the law and the guidances to expand on our outline, but we only got a high-level description of CSV with no recipe. This was not what I had hoped for. From 1997 to 2003, each company tried to figure out what to do. Many consultants were hired. Many really deficient processes were developed. It seems that when a regulated company doesn't know what to do, they create processes that make a ton of documentation, primarily a lot of test scripts, and then they complain about the burden they created for themselves, and they're really unhappy. As a result, I was even more disappointed at the FDA's lack of information. Mm-hmm. We were all looking for the FDA for guidance, but we didn't get it. And in about 2003, I learned of the risk-based approach. And it's a variant of hazard analysis critical control points. They say it's called HACCP. And it's what the food branch of the Food and Drug Administration uses. It works really well. I quickly realized that this greatly improved our outline, and I was able to create my first recipe for CSV. I immediately published my first book in 2004 and provided detailed fill-in-the-blank templates. I even put a CD in the back of the book. I thought the FDA would catch on and issue guidances that aligned with this approach, but it didn't come about. By about, let's say, 2015, I had worked on more than 200 validation projects using the templates from the book, and I had great, consistent results. My business expanded from the U.S. to all over the globe, and I learned something really profound. America is great because we have freedom. We have individual freedom, and I don't see that in any other country to such a great extent. We don't want our government giving us recipes for doing work, so we shouldn't be looking for the FDA to give us the recipe. We want FDA-regulated companies to work together to create global industry standards, and that's what we did. And I'm not really mad anymore. I understand what the FDA was trying to do. Since the FDA doesn't provide a recipe and individual companies don't know how to make a good recipe, and most consultants don't know how to make a good recipe, we have the current state of confusion and misdirection that we have today. But the solution is actually quite simple. Follow the existing global industry standards, meaning use the fill-in-the-blank templates. We have these templates. I've been writing books about them for over a decade. Yeah. We got to get people to use them. Here's something interesting. My fifth book, which was published in 2020, contains exactly the same templates as my first book in 2004. The templates never had to change. They were good back then. The only difference in the new book is the explanation of how software as a service, they say that SaaS now, how it changes CSV. And here's what's amazing. SaaS doesn't change CSV. It only changes installation. The mechanism of CSV, the recipe, is exactly the same regardless of where the software is hosted. And that is something that we really want people to understand. Software as a service doesn't change CSV.
Thank you, David. I totally agree. I totally agree with that sentiment that, we don't like to be told what to do and how to do it. But yet sometimes, we do need some guidance. And the important piece of that, though, is that as an organization, we understand our own organization, right? We know what our intent is. We know what our needs are, and we can take those guidances and make them fit for our particular organization. And as you mentioned, templates are a great way to do that because you fill in the pieces about your organization, and it helps you put everything together correctly and consistently. So I love that. We're going to listen to our next clip, and I think it's going to tie back to what you just said about your templates never changing. So let's take a listen.
CSA is nothing new. It might have a label, a marketing label, CSA, but it had already existed many, many years ago. There's a lot of smart people in the industry that have really drafted guidance, come up with regulations, put guidance out there. So yes, the FDA is very smart. They got a lot of input from the industry. They continue to reach out to the industry. How can we help you? Help us help you, right? And therefore, Cisco's here with us. How can we help the industry, right? GAM5 has been talking about risk-based approach, critical thinking. Really, I'm one of the very few people do not read the entire GAM5, and I'm guilty as sin. I don't report now to my old manager when they used to tell me, "Did you read GAM?" I'm like, "Yes, I did." Well, I didn't. It's a lot of good stuff in it, but I used to just look for summaries and just do my work. But if you really dig deep into ISPE GAM or GAM5 that everyone lives by, all the concept about computer software assurance is in there. Yes, we came up with unscripted, ad hoc testing, etc. But again, this is just to help the industry move forward and automate, right? And move into automation. So again, we're all still within the current regulations. We're not violating anything. Thank you, Cisco, for saying yes. We drafted a guidance because a lot of folks, when we meet with other clients, is there really a guidance? Well, yes, there is. The people in front of you here on the screen have been working tirelessly for the past 4.5 years, coming up with recommendations, right, on how we can make your life easier as an industry practitioner. And yes, there is a guidance. Now, whether that guidance gets released or not, please move forward and do not wait for it. GAM5 is talking about it. There's a lot of other things in the mix that we'll go through.
Okay, David, we just heard the panelists say that CSA is nothing new. There you have it. Corroborated your theory, right? That nothing has changed. Although I'm kidding, because some things have changed, but the processes really haven't. What are your thoughts on this? Do we have all the guidance we need in GAMP5 and from the previous FDA guidance?
Well, I mean, GAMP added to the industry standards for sure.
Right.
Most important, GAMP tells us what software does and doesn't need computer system validation. So that's really valuable. Not every piece of software needs validation. It doesn't provide a good recipe for CSV, though. If you think CSV is IQ, OQ, PQ, which traditionally has been what people thought, then you're part of the masses of companies that have missed the mark. As I said before, the FDA guidances don't provide what we need. I haven't seen the CSA guidance yet, but I think it's going to try and redirect industry so they don't keep doing the wrong things.
Right.
They do the wrong things because they're used to doing the wrong things. It's all based on this testing script-based approach. I think that CSA isn't gonna provide a recipe, and I think it's nothing new. I really want CSA to say, you want to use the risk-based approach, you want to follow a recipe, and you have to go to the industry standards to get that.
Sure. In the same clip, David, we hear the panelists say, don't wait. We know the industry's been shifting to a more risk-based critical thinking approach for years. So what would they be waiting for?
That's really funny. I half-heartedly say there's two primary CSV approaches. The first, the old one, is the test script approach that's completely wrong. And then there's the risk-based approach, which is completely right. Here's what I learned about risk-based anything. Every industry, every business, every parent, and I know this from firsthand experience, uses the risk-based approach to balance activities and safety. Okay? In my family, we say fun and safety. We need to know the risks in order to avoid bad things from happening. Using risk is nothing new. It's in every business. So the reason why we think of risk-based approach as new is because, computers are relatively new, how to validate is relatively new, but applying the risk-based approach has really been around since the 1800s.
Sure.
And so it really isn't anything new. We just have to get used to getting out of the let's test everything to let's think very analytically about everything. And that's a different mindset. And we have to slowly evolve into that. But we've taken so much time getting here. Now I think it's time to not be slow anymore. And let's quickly, right now, maybe using CSA as the catalyst, let's start thinking, we got to do the risk-based approach. We got to use the fill-in-the-blank templates.
Yeah. So just trying to move the industry forward. We're usually slow to embrace change, but in this instance, the time is upon us, right? Let's move more quickly. I got another clip for you. Let's take a listen.
It's clear from the conversations that people have not been applying and have not read fully. They just jump to M3. They don't read the front section, which talks about the philosophies and the thinking, because if they had, they would have been advocating CSA, because that's the frustration when we talk to the GAMP people. They're sitting there going like, we've been saying this for years.
Exactly.
The problem is everyone is looking for the easy fix. They're just looking for the table. They're shutting off their brain. And that is the exact opposite of what CSA is. And the guidance document is just one example of how to implement CSA. It is not the only way. It is not the only. It's got example tables in GAMP, in cooperation with GAMP when we put the GPG together. We listened to what they had to say. There were, many conversations with their CSV leadership. I went through many review boards, and it came together, and it morphed. It's different. It's going to have different thinking, and that's okay.
So in this clip, we hear some thoughts around the current FDA guidances, include not, and they reference, that some of the mistakes or some of the issues may lie in not applying or not fully implementing the concepts that are presented in the guidances. Maybe some folks are looking for an easy fix. I'm not sure. Is CSA the right fix? And will it provide the clarity needed? Or are you anticipating that this is yet another document that will be filed away, but rarely put into practice for any manufacturers?
That's a good question. I think CSA has the opportunity to redirect companies to the risk-based approach. I want them to do that. But since it doesn't have a recipe, companies are still going to need to seek out the global industry standards, the risk-based approach, and use those fill-in-the-blank templates. So I think it's going to help, but I don't think it's really the full solution. And I'm hoping that dialogue like we're doing today will help people understand that you just can't go and look in the guidance to solve your problem. You have to actually go and get educated, get informed. And that's why I think webinars and seminars are so valuable. Maybe one day even the in-person training will come back. That really is the best way to learn. But really learning from someone who's done it a lot of times is really the best way to get the recipe for what you need to follow.
So in follow-up to that, David, what do you think the best ways to get industry to embrace, the new ways of thinking and actually make this shift to quality-focused, risk-based validation practices? Is it training or is it something else?
Well, companies need to understand that the FDA isn't where you get the process. So you can't say, FDA, give it to me. Okay,
Right.
You get the processes from your industry colleagues. And here's the great part. The risk-based CSV approach was developed by a wide array of industry representatives. Like I said, I think there was 400 people on the committee with me back in the mid-90s. We have that available. That's been available. I mean, when I wrote the book, the first book in 2004, and put the CD in the back, I was trying to tell everyone, this is what the FDA didn't give you. And the people that got that CD and popped it in and followed those recipes, they're doing really well with the risk-based approach. So it's just a matter of getting educated. And I try to teach webinars and seminars on a monthly basis to really just, it's so inexpensive and it solves your problem. So I really think there's an opportunity, even without CSA, to really get in the right direction.
Fair enough. Got another clip for you where we'll hear the panelists really talk about what he thinks CSA is for. Let's take a listen.
No, I think that's a good point, Ken, but just want to reiterate, there is nothing against the current regulations right now, right?
Yeah, there's nothing against regulations, but if that's the only way, if you have to be explicitly told each time, I think we addressed that in the article in American Pharmaceutical Review, where we kind of talked about those fallacies. I'll read that offline. But everything within in the space, we've already are okay with risk-based approach. GAMP has already always talked about historically flexibility and leveraging vendor documentations. And look, think about it this way. Or you can go to a software as a service in a company and they completely just say like, hey, I'm going to risk assess away the entire val effort, right? I'm going to do a very, very light PQ. And other places will generate 20 volumes of documentation. Both are compliant. Compliance is not the standard that you should be applying, right? It is, does the system work for us?
Yes.
Is this fit for purpose? Can I trust my data? Did I do my due diligence as a company? The compliance aspects come second. It'll come naturally.
So Dave, this panelist very clearly states that compliance is not the standard that we should be applying. And I think this is not only true, but the heart of this CSA effort. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I often say the number one reason that you want to perform CSV is to increase efficiency, productivity, profitability, protect yourself from litigation. After all that, you do CSV for regulatory compliance. So it's definitely not for regulatory compliance. That's not the number one reason. I think companies respond to it actually makes financial sense to validate. Bad things don't happen when you validate. It's less likely to happen. I think of the FDA as kind of like an elder, like my grandfather, imparting some wisdom to me. Do CSV so you don't hurt anyone with your products. It's kind of the message. We all know that patient safety is number one priority, and we do that by developing the highest quality and safest drugs possible. We really are conscientious about that, and we need CSV to help us to do that. So as soon as we get CSV to be really easy and understandable, we're on our way to doing even better than we've done in the past.
Right. No, and I would agree. And I think that compliance, obviously being compliant helps us to produce higher quality products. And I know that this panelist was really, he's a little bit tongue in cheek the way he speaks, but he was really just saying like, we need to get away from this idea of we're just going to check off the boxes, right, to say we're compliant and actually start doing the activities that, to your point, are going to make us more efficient, more highly productive, boost the quality of our products, etc.
You are totally right.
Excellent. Another clip here for you. Let's take a listen.
Like you look at a system and what's important is you look at its intended use, and within that, like what directly impacts the patient safety and product quality, or indeed the integrity of the quality system itself. And typically every system is made up of a mixture of those. And where critical thinking comes into its own is like, you look at your system and what tool set am I going to use to validate this? I'm not going to take a sledgehammer to this and apply the same type of testing to everything. I'm also going to assess my vendor and look at their quality system and the testing that they have done, because there is no value in repeating all that testing again. Or if the vendor is deficient in some place, I can make an informed decision where I want to maybe beef up my testing. So it's all about, tailor fitting your validation approach based on the intended use of the system, bearing in mind what the vendor has done also.
So, David, I have heard many industry questions around testing approaches and the test documentation that they have historically used for compliance purposes. How should testing be applied, in your opinion? And in your
experience, that's a big question.
Really?
Yeah, that's a big question you're asking here. So if we talk about testing as part of configurable off-the-shelf, commercial off-the-shelf COTS CSV, then it's no more than 20% of the effort. So it's really been reduced when you go to the risk-based approach. You know, it used to be like 80%. Now it's only 20%. The risk-based approach, the goal is to create good specifications. So it's not about the testing, it's about the specifications. And these specifications detail how to configure and use the software in processes to get real GXP work done. We do this by first writing requirements. So requirements are the first step, and they describe what we want and need. I think of it as a grocery list, okay? Then we write specifications based on specific intended use. Now, those last three words, specific intended use, are the key to understanding CSV. What we do to our specifications is we run them through a risk assessment, which we call now a hazard analysis. It came from HACCP, so that HA part of HACCP is the hazard analysis. So when we do that, we learn of mitigations, things that reduce risk. There's two types of mitigations, automatic and manual. An automatic mitigation is a function in the software that does something to protect you automatically, like not allow a duplicate lot number. A manual mitigation is something the software can't do. For example, making sure that the data entry was done correctly, where you need another human being, okay? So mitigations of both types are added back to the specification. Now that's the key to it. Your specs get improved by running it through the hazard analysis and learning of the mitigations, the things that save you, which we then add back to the specifications, which make them better, smarter, stronger, okay? So now we've got good specs. It's the automatic mitigations that we now have to test, because we said they're going to save us and they're going to save us automatically. We got to prove that it really does it, because we think it does. So now we're going to make sure it does. We also want to test for proper configuration. That's the C in COTS, you know, configurable. We really want to make sure our configuration is proper. The risk-based CSV approach is really a small amount of testing compared to the testing CSV approach. I usually say 2/3 reduction in testing. That's enormous.
Yeah, that's huge. It's huge. I mean, it's, you know, time and resources back in your company. You know, more time to focus on creativity and not documentation or that kind of thing.
Right. I always say, get back to real work.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So David, since we all agree there's no value in repeating testing and that more rigorous testing should only be applied to higher risk activities, how do we use this combined knowledge to eliminate redundancies?
Let's see. So when we say don't repeat testing, we don't mean, you know, don't repeat any testing.
Right.
We're saying don't repeat the testing that the vendor already did. And we know the vendor already did it because we audited the vendor before we ever bought the software from the vendor. So we know the vendor's already tested things kind of in a generic way, okay? But the vendor did not configure and specify the system for your specific intended use. Remember those three key words again.
Right.
We do repeat tests. Yeah, so we do repeat tests like from one validation project to another, but we're not repeating all the testing the vendor did. A lot of my clients will say, David, instead of doing this, you know, risk-based approach, how about if we just buy test scripts from the vendor? And then they'll even say, how about if we pay the vendor to execute the test scripts? And that's two wrong things in a row. We don't want to buy test scripts because we don't need to repeat them. And we surely don't want someone to execute them because then we don't learn anything. So we really don't want to go through that testing approach method. What we want to do is just use the risk-based approach and figure out what small amount needs to be tested and then focus our attention on that.
Great. And to expand a little bit more into that concept that you're just describing there, intended use, as you mentioned, is an important factor in validation activities, obviously. We all know that, but there are likely differences between the facilities and the vendor's objectives, which you alluded to, right? You can't just take it out the box and assume it's going to work for you. You need to configure it accordingly. So leveraging the testing done by a vendor should be carefully considered, as you did mention, before implementation. But why does this trip so many people up? And will CSA solve for that, do you think?
That's interesting. If we confirm that the vendor has design specifications, that's how they built the software, and the software has been tested to verify that those specifications have been implemented correctly, then we can leverage the vendor's testing. Leveraging it means we don't have to repeat it. This simply means that you're only going to do testing related to those automatic mitigations and your specific intended use, which is going to greatly reduce the total amount of testing you have to do. So I think CSV is going to be improved by CSA because it's going to kind of say, use the risk-based approach, don't do so much testing. But again, because CSA doesn't have the recipe, I mean, we really need CSA to say, go get yourself a recipe. Use fill-in-the-blank templates. Use the industry standards that are out there. I'm not sure it's going to say that, though. Historically, the guidance documents have not said that.
Right. I would suspect you're probably correct on that. We have another clip I want you to take a listen to that dives even deeper into this idea of testing. Take a listen.
I guess a big difference, which Ken alluded to earlier on, is within CSA, there's new testing techniques called exploratory testing and ad hoc testing. So I guess we're all familiar with traditional scripted testing, where you've got a test objective followed by step-by-step instructions on what the tester needs to do. And while they've got their place for high-risk function, they come with significant burden in that how often do we see a test case failed because there's a protocol generation error. And you've heard me say it before, and I kind of laugh, but it's true. Sometimes we test our test protocol more than the system that's under validation to scrub out all the tests. And it's true. I've seen it myself, and I've done it myself. Where CSA comes into its own, it's got depend for lower risk features and functions. It's got ad hoc and unscripted testing. So what's unscripted testing? Well, as Ken alluded to, it's you create a test objective, but how the tester meets that is up to the tester. And we're finding out that that's kind of better, because typically testers are executing more of the code in how to meet the test objective rather than just following the same path all the time. One, I guess, step lower than that is your ad hoc testing, where you only have where the tester records after the fact and the testing that they have done to verify a requirement. But again, you'd only use that for low risk functionality. So it's right sizing the validation tool set that you're going to use to ensure you get the maximum test coverage, to make the maximum use of your time with the system during a validation, rather than spending it trying to debug a test protocol.
So here, do you have thoughts on traditional test methods compared to this exploratory or ad hoc testing, which is being highlighted in the pending CSA guidance?
Oh, wow. You bring up some new terms here. Okay, so let's make sure we're all using the same terms and definitions. First, let's define test case and test script. Those are two different things. A test case is short and identifies what is to be tested. It gives a high-level set of instructions, and it may be something like do something, like create a work order. It doesn't tell you exactly how to do it. It's followed by a single verification statement, which is the acceptance criteria for the test. And finally, a print statement to obtain the documented evidence. So a test case is short, usually 3 short sentences. In contrast, there is the test script. And this is what, for decades, everyone's been using and everyone doesn't like. And they always say, why am I doing it? And they're saying, I'm doing it because we've always done it that way. A test script is written for a robot and gives step-by-step instructions. I mean, really baby steps, like push this key, click on this button. And it may have multiple verification statements and multiple print statements, okay? This is absolutely the wrong thing to do because it takes a huge amount of time. It has very little benefit. If you're just following a robotic set of instructions, you're not really thinking. And a simple change in the steps breaks the test, which causes false failures. So the test script is you're just burning a lot of time on something that isn't necessary. And that's the key. It's not necessary, and it's not as valuable as a test case, which is shorter. And that's kind of counterintuitive. It's actually shorter is better because it makes the tester think. Test cases are written by the users of the software to confirm that their specifications that they configured are being implemented correctly. As I said before, the specification document is how the software is used, and it includes all those automatic mitigations from the risk assessment. So we know we've got safer specifications. As such, there are few test cases needed for the COTS CSV risk-based method. And what's really important, I mean, this is so important to understand, you have to do the validation with the end users. You can't get someone off the street. You can't hire a consultant. You can't hire the vendor. You have to take your users that are busy working. You got to get them to go on, this is the joke we use, it's called the validation vacation. You're going on a vacation from your work, but you're not leaving work, okay?
Yeah.
It's just a validation vacation. And, it's only about 2 weeks for a big validation project. For a small one, it could be just a few days. It's that much shorter than it used to be because we don't have thousands of test scripts to run anymore. And what happens is people understand it. And it's much more like once they do it a couple times, they're like, this is the way to go. And then they don't hate it and they actually want to do it. So it really does change kind of the culture of your company.
Yeah. And if they can automate their testing, then it takes even less time. So,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. I have another clip here I want you to listen to. This is the FDA panelist talking a little bit more about CSV versus CSA. Let's take a listen.
The agency is really trying to facilitate and drive a lot more of the assistance, right? Some bringing the right technical expertise together, not just within CDRH, but as broadly as we can from an agency standpoint to make it very easy for this technology and these technologies to make their way forward. I think as Khaled mentioned, we've learned, we were impacted by it. A lot of companies were impacted by it. When we've got that technology capability, we've got some of that data available, it makes organizations a lot more resilient, right? Capable to really adjust and move quickly when situations like what happened in the pandemic occur. Companies that were more invested in that, we saw their capability to at least sustain a bit better. So the goal here has been to really facilitate that happening. This is not something that the FDA doesn't support, right? We really do encourage that. As part of our efforts, we're trying to transform. We're trying to collectively get better about data. That means that we need to have that data coming in and available, and that's not going to happen if people aren't investing in the technologies or driving that that collective, infrastructure push moving forward. So one of the things we heard early on when all of this started was that the idea of CSV is a barrier. And this touches back on, I think, what Khaled addressed and one of the questions that came up. CSV, you've got to do it. Ray, he called it a necessary evil. But the reality is that it's just a necessity no matter what, right? And what we're trying to do is reset to what that necessity is and not make it about it being a regulatory burden. You're going to implement the systems. As you're a small company, this will help cut down some of the burden and focus you right on the risk discussion that really needs to be happening when you're moving forward. But it also frees up capital, time, and ways to implement technology that may help you as a small company to really get off the ground and help cut costs, drive your, the data that you've got available to make your cases as you present things to the FDA. It all starts to really blend together as we move forward. And the Digital Health Center of Excellence that was stood up was really intended to help be a focal point within the agency to keep pace with what's going on outside within the technology landscape, within industry, challenges that we're hearing like this. And how do we collectively as an agency move forward and tackle those? But at the same time, how do we provide at least a central resource for people to come and ask the questions?
So here we hear case for quality. Is this, and I'm wondering if this is impacting the collective infrastructure and solutions? And is the idea of CSV a barrier?
Barrier. That's an interesting concept. Let's see. So COTS CSV is absolutely essential. So people don't think it's essential because it's been reduced to this like robotic exercise. But if you actually do it properly, then it's definitely something you have to do before you use a system. It's kind of like, when you get a new car or you rent a car, you got to like move all the settings. You got to change the seat and the rear view mirror, the side view mirrors, the radio stations. You got to like change all that. That's your configuration. You want to do that before you ever start driving. So CSV is like that. You want to set up your system before you ever drive the system. It's performed by users, and the users learn how the system can work. They learn of all those options, and then they set the configuration, and then they use this configuration that they've set up to create processes to get their real work done. So CSV is only a barrier, like it's only blocking progress if you do it in a way that has little value and it's just a big documentation exercise. If you do it correctly, it's the opposite of a barrier. It's actually a catalyst to get the software implemented quickly and properly the first time. And that's why it's so valuable.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
We also hear in this clip that reference to reducing regulatory burden. So if we cut down on the regulatory burden, does that allow us to better focus on the data and keep pace with technology?
I don't agree that there's regulatory burden. I think we made the regulatory burden. Remember, the FDA doesn't give us a recipe.
Right.
Many companies have illogical CSV approaches that frustrate and confuse everyone in their company. Many companies use resources other than the users that makes matters worse. I mean, if you hire a temp that knows nothing about your business and nothing about validation, that's a disservice to yourself. But a lot of companies do it that way. Virtually every client comes to me with a mess, and I replace that mess with fill-in-the-blank templates that are easy to understand. The validation projects make sense. They take a reasonable small amount of time, and the corporate culture changes to embrace CSV it becomes an ongoing part of your life. It's part of your job.
Sure. I've got one last clip for our audience to listen to and to get your thoughts on, David. And it's the panelist here is talking about the actual implementation of CSA. So let's take a listen.
How do we go about implementing CSA if they want to implement CSA without making major changes to their SOPs or trainings? Ken, if you can provide your thought on.
So, first off, it doesn't require revision. We're talking about the same ultimate domain of knowledge. They can quickly. First and foremost, I think I would look if you're going now. I would definitely get the GPG, Data Integrity by Design, and see what's there, because it'll give you context, some history, some examples, and enough for you to get started along the path. And if it were me, I would then be looking at doing this at the val plan level, at the individual plan level, as opposed to trying to think linearly and go like, well, hey, I got to change all these SOPs. Typically, the val plan already has enough flexibility for an individual system, such that would be the point where I would implement the change and make sure. And when we went on our journey, we did a retrospective analysis of our data to make sure that as we adjusted our approach, that we would not have introduced errors into production. And we really went there.
So from a consulting perspective, David, what are your thoughts on the implementation of CSA?
I actually think CSA is going to help companies seek out consultants like me, like other consultants.
It's going to be good for
they're
you.
Going to say, they're going to say, teach us the risk-based approach. We want them to say that because we want everyone to use the risk-based approach. I think changing the name from CSV to CSA, though, I think that's really confusing. I don't even think that's necessary. It's almost like you're saying CSV was wrong. That's not right. It was the testing-based CSV approach that was wrong. So I think CSA can promote the risk-based CSV. I think it will help companies seek out the proper kinds of consultants. I'm a teaching consultant. I teach you how to do it for yourself. So I think that's what we really want. We want companies to say, I have to do it myself. Teach me how to do it correctly.
Sure. And I think part of, and again, I haven't seen the guidance either. You know, it hasn't actually been released yet, but they are doing a lot of speaking about it. And I think part of the idea of CSA, or the switch from systems validation to software assurance, was meant, and I'm only guessing, but from what I've been able to gather, was meant really to remind folks that you're thinking about quality, you're thinking about being assured that your software and your processes are working as intended, instead of just going through the validation activities and checking off the boxes. So I understand. I agree. I don't disagree with you that there might be some confusion as to like, why are we going from CSV to CSA? But I think once people really start to understand that it's the outcomes, it's the assurance, it's the quality that we are striving for, instead of the activities that get us there, that it'll start to make more sense, I hope.
Hey, I hope so too, and you might be absolutely correct. So, but my experience is that if you introduce more terms to people, they get more confused.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that thought too. Well, David, I appreciate the thoughts that you've shared here and your reactions to some of these clips. I think, you know, this is a topic that I hear a lot of our listeners and a lot of our IVT audience are discussing amongst themselves. And I definitely know that there is some uncertainty or some questions out there. So your clarification has been helpful, and I very much appreciate it. And as we get ready to wrap up this episode, I just want to see if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave our listeners with.
Sure. I think the easiest way to learn CSV correctly is to actually do a validation project using the templates. Start with something small like an Excel spreadsheet or just a module of a larger system. What's going to happen is the validation process will probably, for the first time in your life, make sense. It won't take a huge amount of time, and you're going to get useful documentation that's actually meaningful to you, not just something that you check a box for some auditor.
Right.
Here's something interesting. This week, I finished my 307th validation project. And I got to tell you, those templates, I still don't have them memorized, but the templates really guide me through it every single time. They've never let me down. So I just want to thank you for talking with me. I like some of your ideas, and I really hope that what you're saying comes about.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I just want to remind our listeners that this panel discussion is just a snapshot in time and reflects only a partial view or review of the topic. All panelists' opinions are their own, and this should serve as a jumping off point for future discussion, as we are all still talking about this topic. I'd like to thank today's guest, David Nettleton, for sharing his expertise and weighing in on the CSA Revolution discussion. Also, a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, for all of his time in editing these sessions. Lastly, thank you to you, our valued listeners. We want to hear your thoughts and questions on this topic. Help us continue the discussion by sharing this with your online networks. Also, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. This week, we are offering an exclusive download of the entire CSA Revolution session, free for our listeners. Simply visit www.ivtnetwork.com/podcast to download and listen. And feel free to email your questions and comments to customerservice@ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another can't miss episode. Until then, make it a great week.